Let's go back to 1979. The Soviet Union, it's one of the world's two superpowers, with this massive empire and an army that seemed unstoppable. But then, in December of that year, its leaders made a decision, a fateful decision to invade Afghanistan. And that one choice, well, it kicked off a decade-long war that would bleed the empire dry and, as we'll see, hit the gas pedal on the collapse of the Soviet Union itself.
So how does that happen? How does a superpower, an entity that seems to be at the absolute peak of its power, make one move that speeds up its own destruction? You see, the Soviet-Afghan War wasn't just some regional conflict. It was a turning point. It was the moment that exposed all these fatal weaknesses that were hidden deep inside the Soviet system.
And this timeline, it tells the entire story in just 4 dates. Look at that. Only 10 years between the invasion and the withdrawal. And just 2 years after that, the entire Soviet Union is gone. That incredibly fast unraveling, that's not a coincidence. It's the direct consequence we're going to break down right now. Okay, so we have to start with the decision itself. You have to ask why. Why did the Kremlin's leaders, who were known for being pretty cautious, send the Red Army into a country famously called the Graveyard of Empires, especially when their own top generals were screaming at them not to do it? Well, the answer really starts with ideology, this idea called the Brezhnev Doctrine. This was basically the rule book for Soviet foreign policy. It said they had the right to step in anywhere a friendly socialist government was in trouble. So when the communist government down in Kabul started to fall apart, the Politburo, that's the tiny circle of men running the show, felt they had no choice. For them, letting a socialist neighbor fail was just unthinkable. It could start a chain reaction. And this, right here, was the fundamental, catastrophic miscalculation. The Soviet leaders were looking at Afghanistan through these thick, Marxist-colored glasses. They saw a backward country that was just ready to be transformed into a socialist state. They totally, completely missed the reality on the ground. A fiercely independent, tribal society where the real unifying force wasn't communism, it was Islam. They thought they were getting a new ally. What they actually got was a hornet's nest.
You know, the debate inside the Kremlin was actually really intense. The Afghan government was practically begging for Soviet troops. But the top military guys, people like Marshal Ogarkov, were warning them that sending in a small force would be a total disaster. But their advice was ignored. The KGB, led by a paranoid Yuri Andropov who was terrified of America getting a foothold there, pushed hard for invasion. So in the end, the decision wasn't some well-thought-out state policy. Nope. It was made in secret by a tiny group of old, out-of-touch men who just set a catastrophe in motion.
So the decision's made. The Red Army rolls into Afghanistan. And they're expecting a quick surgical operation. Get in, install a friendly leader, and get out. But what they found instead was a holy war, a jihad, that would trap them for a decade in a brutal, bloody quagmire. And the war kicks off with this incredibly dramatic event. Soviet Spetsnaz commandos launch Operation Storm 333. They storm the presidential palace, kill the Afghan president, and install their own guy, Babruk Karmal. But this act of pure aggression, it backfired immediately. It turned what was a local civil war into a nationwide resistance against foreign, non-believing invaders. So how did the Soviets try to control this huge, hostile country? Basically, with brute force. Their strategy had 3 parts. First, intimidation. They used their helicopters and tanks to just wipe entire villages off the map, hoping to scare people away from supporting the resistance. Second, subversion. They sent spies in to try and break up the resistance groups from the inside. And third, old-fashioned military missions to hunt down fighters. But all these tactics did was make the Afghan people even angrier and more determined to fight. And that resistance, the Mujahideen, turned out to be an incredibly smart and effective enemy. They used the mountains perfectly, launching surprise raids and ambushes. They focused on sabotage, blowing up power lines, pipelines, you name it. But here's the crucial part. They weren't alone. A massive CIA program called Operation Cyclone funneled billions of dollars worth of weapons and aid through Pakistan. This turned a local fight into a full-blown proxy war. And for the Soviets, it quickly became a tactical stalemate they just could not win. You see, the real price of this war wasn't just being paid in Afghanistan. Its effects were being felt thousands of miles away, right back home in the Soviet Union. The war became what one person called a Frankenstein, a monster created by the state that was now coming back to tear it apart. The damage became so obvious, so undeniable, that by 1986, the new leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, publicly called the war a bleeding wound. Now, for the leader of the USSR to say that out loud, that was absolutely stunning. It was a signal that the terrible consequences of the war could no longer be covered up by state propaganda. And when you look at the numbers, you can see just how massive the economic drain was. We're talking billions upon billions of rubles just poured into this failing war year after year. Now remember, this was happening in a rigid, planned economy that was already having trouble making things like shoes and bread for its own people. Pouring all this money into the military was a catastrophe. The war was literally starving the Soviet system of the cash it desperately needed to function. So, here's the crucial point. All these failures in Afghanistan created this perfect storm of decay back home. Experts point to 4 key effects that all work together. First, perception. Seeing the invincible Red Army get stuck in a stalemate gave independence movements in other Soviet republics a huge boost of confidence. Second, it crushed the army's morale. Third, it stirred up ethnic tensions, because soldiers from places like Ukraine or Latvia felt like they were dying in a Russian war. And finally, the war created a powerful new group of critics.
And that brings us to the Afghanzi, the veterans of the war. They didn't come home as heroes. They came home as angry, disillusioned men who had seen the government's lies and failures up close. They brought back stories of brutality and incompetence that completely destroyed the official propaganda. They even formed their own groups, becoming this vocal, critical force that the Communist Party just couldn't control.
So by the middle of the 1980s, the writing was on the wall. The failure in Afghanistan was undeniable. The economic pain, the social unrest, it was all piling up, forcing a new generation of Soviet leaders to face a very hard truth. This war had to end. But ending it would unleash forces that they had no idea how to control. Now, this graph tells a really fascinating story. Just look at how military spending on the war actually spiked in the last few years. It's like they were throwing everything they had left into one last, desperate push to try and get some kind of victory before they pulled out. When that failed, that unsustainable cost, which you can see so clearly here, made withdrawal not just a choice, but an absolute necessity. They literally could not afford to stay any longer. And here we get to the ultimate irony of this entire story. The massive crisis created by the war in Afghanistan is what directly led to Mikhail Gorbachev's famous reforms, Glasnost, which means openness, and Perestroika, which means restructuring. Now, he didn't create these policies to tear down the Soviet Union. Quite the opposite. He introduced them to save it, to fix a system that the war had exposed as corrupt, broken, and bankrupt. But in trying to fix the system, he accidentally shattered it. So, after all that, what do we take away from this decade of war? What's the lasting legacy of the Soviet Union's own Vietnam? Well, when you look at all the evidence, the final verdict seems pretty clear. The Soviet Union was already sick, right? It had deep structural problems. But the war in Afghanistan, that was the critical accelerant. It was like pouring gasoline on a fire that was already smoldering. It turned a slow decline into a sudden, unstoppable collapse by bankrupting the state, destroying the credibility of the army and the party, and shattering the myth of Soviet power for good.
And that leaves us with a final and pretty sobering question. The Soviet Union is history, but that graveyard of empires is still there. This whole story serves as a powerful, timeless warning, doesn't it? It's about the huge, often unforeseen consequences that happen when a great power completely misjudges a foreign land and gets trapped in a war it can't win and can't afford to lose.